Greetings, everybody. As you can see, I'm dressed in a snow suit because it's very cold in Sydney at the moment. People think of Australia as a warm country, but we actually have a lot of snow in Australia, although there's none in Sydney, thankfully. All right. Okay, so what I'm going to do is share my screen. Hopefully it'll allow me to do that. And I should be able to pick my slides. Okay, so can everybody see what's on the screen? You should see Back to the Future. Someone nod their head. Christian?
Yeah.
All good? All right. Okay, let me see if I can do slideshow, because that only works half the time. There we go.
Yeah, that's working.
Okay, now bear in mind I won't be able to see the text chat or anything because I'm full screen. I've only got one screen on my system. But nevertheless, here we go. So this is, I suppose, what I call Back to the Future, in the sense that, you know, the traditional way of doing mathematics exams with a pen or a pencil and a piece of paper. Now we move into the era of e-assessment and fantastic things like Stack and Numbers and Maple TA and all these systems that are floating around there. Introduce, obviously, a keyboard input or mouse input into the picture. And it requires, I suppose, different skills, and it appears to have a sort of a different sort of thought pattern. You know, scribbling, drawing, sketching is certainly part of things like engineering. A lot of the academics in engineering. So I'm not a mathematics academic, and I'm not a STEM academic. But when I talk to other people, I work in a lot of central units in universities over the last 10 years, and I talk to academics, I talk to students, and what they sort of say. So when I did research at University of Queensland a couple of years ago, I asked students off the cuff in a large survey. We had about 1,000 responses from across the university, and there was differences about what students thought about the potential for e-assessment according to the discipline areas that they were in. So we had people from law and social science saying, yes, please give us an e-exam so we can type our responses. Whereas the students from the STEM disciplines, particularly maths and engineering, said, no, please don't make it compulsory. I hate typing formulas in a computer. So there was this sort of impact, if you will, according to, I guess, the knowledge production, knowledge representation modalities that we have in different disciplines. And now I've been thinking about this over a number of years, and this survey was back in 2015, so it's been sort of munching in my head for a while. And I've come across things like Stack, which has been fantastic. When I was working at UNSW last year, they have Stack, and their STEM disciplines use it quite extensively. Now, for those of you who don't know, Stack is a Moodle plugin, and it's got a computer algebra system behind it, and allows you to more or less program, code up questions that can be automatically assessed by the computer. So from that point of view, it's quite flexible and quite powerful, but often requires the students to input via the keyboard their responses or click things on their mouse. Whereas in thinking and working things out, but say in engineering, you might draw forces diagrams and you have a whole bunch of sort of formulas and you might do a proof or something. Traditionally, that's been done with a pen. Now, I acknowledge you can use things like LaTex. So if you're an expert mathematician, you're an expert technologist, you can type in LaTex and be quite efficient. But for many students, particularly in large first-year classes where many of the students may not be STEM majors, they might be just general majors that could be taken as an elective. Teaching students LaTex is an uphill battle for many people. So anyway, this trial I'm going to talk about here was about how do we bridge this gap. So this trial was at University of New South Wales, which is a large research-intensive university. I should get you back to the next slide. So UNSW, even though I'm now at Macquarie, this is a trial from last year. It's a top 100 research intensive. There's about 59,000 students in the institution. I mean, the engineering department alone has something like 18,000 students. So, the large first year classes can be quite huge. We're talking 2,000 students in a first year class. And obviously the opportunities to use the assessment to help with efficiency, but also authenticity. You know, modern tools of the trade is certainly attractive. So this particular trial was actually done in a new online program, a Masters of Data Science. And this particular unit that we did the pilot in had a mix of content from the maths department, from the business department, and from the people who teach statistics. So there was a bit of information systems, there was a bit of statistics, there was a bit of mathematics all mixed into this course. And what the academics wanted to do was essentially replicate a paper exam in the online environment. But they also wanted it to be highly secure, highly confidential. So we were in this position where we had to design an approach where we could allow students to do working out as much as possible in the traditional pen and paper sense. And by the way, they wouldn't allow the students to have a piece of paper to do rough working out, because the academics would not, what their opinion was that they didn't want the students to take away their questions after the end of the exam. So we had to try and force it as a fully online. So there was also added complication of remote proctoring. And we're actually piloting this for one of the first times in the institution. So we had to replicate a paper exam in an online only environment. There couldn't be any pens at all. It was all through bring your own device. It was all through online invigilation. Now, this is going to create a whole lot of complexity, which I'll get to a bit later, but it did cause us some problems. So we're looking at about 150 students across two cohorts. There were several months apart between the cohorts for this data. In this presentation, I guess what I want to do is try and focus on what I refer to as digital inking. Now, some other colleagues at UNSW had been experimenting with digital inking, particularly David Kellerman in the engineering department. And he'd been looking at using things like Microsoft Surface tablets in order to have students write out their formulas, sketch out their engineering problems, and share them in a large class situation. And I think those experiments were quite successful. But from the point of view of an examination, we were facing problems with adopting that idea directly, because the remote proctoring system insisted that the webcam is facing the student, whereas the typical orientation of a Surface tablet, when you want to write on it, is flat on the table. So the camera is pointing to the ceiling. So that was a problem. The other point of the problem was these were online only students. So the assumption is we couldn't bring them to the campus. I remember this is all pre-COVID days as well. We couldn't bring them to the campus because they were spread out all over the country and some internationally. So, and we couldn't really insist they go and buy a Surface Pro device because they're quite expensive devices, particularly for low SES students. So we had to look for economical solutions as well. And as you saw on the first slide, I'll just go back to it. That device in the bottom right-hand corner costs less than 50 Australian dollars. So let's just say 40 something US dollars. And that's a reasonable size, what they call a graphics tablet. And these are commonly used in the arts and graphic design and architecture and people like that. In fact, people do fantastically, fine arts using these input devices. So from my perspective, I thought, well, if a fine artist can do really detailed art with this input device, then hopefully there's enough detail in there for somebody to write out a formula. Now, what I think I underestimated a little bit was the learning curve for this, but I'll get to that a little bit later. But as you can see on the picture there, that was about my third attempt to copy out a formula for one of the model answers. So I was trying to test out to see if this was going to work. And you can see that some of the characters are not quite readable, but it's probably no worse than what you'd get on a typical scribble that a student might do under stress using a pen and paper in the exam room. So from that point of view, I felt this was a viable option. Okay, let's go forward. Okay, here's some more examples. So what we also used was, we were going to use, we're thinking about what was the software environment as well to use in this situation. And we played with using OneNote because the university is a Microsoft shop from that point of view. They have an office online, they have Teams, and there's all sorts of functionality in Teams. So we were looking at using a combination of OneNote, Microsoft Forms, and the proctoring service. But what we found out after playing with many combinations and permutations wasn't going to allow us to have a sort of a secure release and take back mechanism. You know, you couldn't sort of release things and take it back in the same ease that you can with a Moodle quiz. You can set it's available now, and you can give a timer, and you can, you know, make it unavailable. So from that point of view, the Moodle quiz environment, in my mind anyway, was an ideal mechanism to do it. But the Moodle system at our university didn't have any mechanism to have pen input into the quizzing tool. So we installed something called Poddle, which is actually a whole tool set for language teachers, nothing to do with maths. But so they had a lot of video recording and audio recording and stop play and all sorts of fancy things. But they had this drawing tool in there as well. And fortunately, it was already in the code base for the service provider that hosted the Moodle system. So we were able to get this thing installed within about 4 weeks, because we also had really tight timelines to get this project done as well. If we'd gone for a different sort of product, we would have to go through probably a 6 to 12 months evaluation process to get a new plugin into the system. So that was out of the question. So a few lucky coincidences, or not, depending on what you see the results. So you can see we installed it on the 8th of August. We had enough time to play with it, I guess, and the first pilot exam went live on the 15th of October. So you can see in terms of getting a new system into a large university bureaucracy, this was, I think, done in record time, put it that way. But it also provided the ability to annotate images as well. So if the academics wanted to stick, say, a tree diagram and have students fill things in, annotate that, they could do that. Or you could have a blank canvas where students would be able to just write formulas or do diagrams and things like that. We tested several sorts of pen input device tablets, graphics tablets as they're known, and we gave students a recommendation of selection that they could choose. We recommended to buy the largest dimension tablet that you could, because the movement of the pen on the tablet is closer to one-to-one to what you see on a screen with a larger tablet. Whereas with a smaller one, you move like 1 inch on the tablet and it's 2 inches on the screen. And that makes writing a lot harder, particularly if you want to write, as you can see on the screen there, detailed formula or diagrams or things like that. So there's a sort of a tip to there. Now, the other reason I went down this path is this thing generates static images, and a colleague, David Kellerman, was working, or had another project working on, or working towards, using artificial intelligence to interpret graphical responses to questions in order to mark them. His initial work was around marking axes of a graph or a chart. So where the response was an expected pattern on the screen. So I think there's probably some possibilities here in the future that the images generated by the text input tool here could be fed in due course through to an artificial intelligence marking system. And that might be several years in the future, but I think it's about thinking towards the future and where this might go in the future as well. Now, how it sort of worked, I'm not sure how many people are familiar with online proctoring systems, but that actually formed quite a big part of this pilot, even though it had anything to do with digital inking. So for those not familiar, here it goes. So the idea is that the academic prepares the exam that gets scheduled. So we're looking at the steps on the right-hand side of the slide at the moment. The student has to pre-register in the online exam system. The student also has to book a slot to confirm their time slot. Now, we tried to have all the students sit within a very limited window, but there was maybe a couple of start windows that were 30 minutes apart, even though it was a 3-hour exam. And that had to do with the back-end logistics of the proctoring provider. There's a side recommendation here that make sure the proctoring provider can do, if you want live human invigilation, make sure their simultaneous sitting capacity is big enough for your cohorts. don't ask, don't tell on the part of the proctoring providers. So in terms of the exam time, the student logs into Moodle like they normally do. We set up a Moodle quiz that got released at the right time. They would have to log into the proctoring provider. So they go to the Moodle, they click on a link to the proctoring provider, which is an LTI link. They get logged in. In the proctoring provider, they do some ID checks. So they show their ID card on the screen. They have to type some text into a box, which is typing pattern recognition. And they go through that, and the proctor says, you know, are you ready to go? When the student's ready to go, they press a button on there that then takes them back to the Moodle quiz. From that point onwards, they're in Moodle. The system is a bit like well, a bit like Zoom for that matter. Essentially what happens is the student's screen is recorded and their webcam stream is also recorded, and they're able to communicate with the proctor if they need to for help. Now, after the exam, obviously, everything just shuts down, goes away. Now, during the other part of this equipment, I suppose, requirements or procedures is the stuff that the student has to have. Obviously, they need a laptop. Now, we recommend that they didn't use a Surface Pro because of the way the laptop is orientated when you're working on it. If you know, the camera is facing you and you try to draw on the screen, it's uncomfortable. So we recommended people use the graphics tablet, a standard laptop. So that means that any laptop can become a graphics station as soon as you plug in a USB device, the USB graphics tablet. And of course, they need to have access to the internet. Now, the slight problem was the internet connection requirements, 3 megabits up and 3 megabits down. Now, the 3 megabits down is not generally a problem for most people. That's a fairly run-of-the-mill internet connection these days, even with ADSL. But where we actually ran into problems was the 3 megabits upload speed. In Australia, we have something what I call fraudband rather than broadband. The original plan for our national fibre network got trashed by the neoliberals, and we ended up with this mixed mode technology of a hodgepodge of cables and copper wires and all sorts of rubbish. The bottom line is the common upload speed in Australia is only 1 megabits, because that's the sort of the national plan. The whole national wholesaler has these plans, plan tiers. And of course, students being poor, which one do you think they choose, right? They choose the lowest plans commonly, which is 12 down, 1 up. And of course, the proctoring provider recommends 3 megabits up. So that caused some problems. All right, I'll move on. This is what it looks like. On the right-hand side, you can see a webcam stream of the student. It's live. It's also recorded. So you're able to essentially audit the whole session afterwards. On the right-hand side is essentially a screen capture of the student's screen. And you can see the environment that was used. On the right-hand side, we've got a Moodle quiz question. And then there's the Moodle response form where the student could draw. In this case, they drew a sort of a structural tree diagram. And you could watch them drawing that in the video if you wanted to sit there and watch the post-recorded video as well, which was useful from the point of view that if for some reason their laptop crashed or something went wrong with saving into Moodle, for example, that we had this idea of a backup. So the video was a backup to what happened, or at least up until that point. Fortunately, most of the stuff in Moodle was all right. You know, Moodle quizzes got an autosave functionality. The drawing tool also had an autosave functionality. However, the drawing tool had a quirk, a usability quirk, where if you didn't press down on the screen after typing some text in, you could potentially lose that text. So it was a bit of a gotcha for the students. However, we did recommend that the students go off and do a practice run. We gave them a set of instructions and guidelines and watch out for this stuff. We gave them a list of all the caveats. But, you know, students being students, do you think they did the practice? So anyway, here we go, remote exams. This is what the students thought. Now, unfortunately, the response rate, so out of the 150 odd people we had do this, only about 26 responded. So it was what I would call a not very reliable response, but nevertheless, we have what we have. Those people who did respond by and large, didn't like what they did, what the experience was. And there's quite a few warnings, I guess, out of this that point directly back to good practice. but there was a couple of main things. The drawing tool itself wasn't designed for this purpose specifically. So as I said, there was some usability gotchas in there, particularly around with the input of text. The vendor staff, the proctoring vendor staff, were not exactly up to the mark, you might say. And this goes to, I suppose, if you're going to work with an external service provider, you need to go above and beyond with the relationship to really reinforce with the groups of people who are going to be dealing with your students exactly the nature of the exams that you're going to be dealing with. Because these proctoring providers are essentially call center services, and there could be random groups of people coming in. So I think there's a lesson here that not to take anything for granted in this space, particularly if you're going to do something unusual like this pilot was. If we'd been running a multiple choice online Moodle quiz, I think it would have been a lot easier, and there would have been less complications, but we had quite specific requirements in this case. Problem with the internet, again, remember, these are only the people who responded, and I might be cynical, but I'm probably going to say here that the people who responded were the ones who were a little bit peeved off with the process, who ran into trouble, so they thought they'd tell us about it. Whereas all the people who thought, oh yeah, it was really good and whatever, yeah, didn't bother to reply. But anyway, that's speculation on my part. Problem with the internet was, you know, almost a quarter of those issues. But to be honest, when I read all the comments, most of the comments were around the usability issues. That's why it's number A. Drawing tool was clunky, was sort of where more the comments came out. As I said, there were quite a few caveats around why this was so. Let's look at those. Well, okay, pilot overall responses, despite the 25% negative responses, feedback from the cohort, i.e. those people who responded tended to be negative. I think it was a technical success. All students were able to successfully finish the exam. All students were able to finish the questions that they needed to. They were able to do their text input or their graphical pen input. So that from that, and they used BYOD. This was over proctoring. This was over crappy internet. It was almost the worst possible way to do a pilot for digital inking. But nevertheless, I think it was, I would say, qualified success. Minimum viable product is there. Some improvements would be needed. Now, issues were partly due to the students not reading the instructions, RFTM, as they say, right? Now, we can expect that's going to happen, right? We can expect that's going to happen. So what we have to do is take that into consideration. What we really need to be doing, I guess, is scaffolding practice into the design of the course. Now, we knew that was the case, but again, because of the really tight timeline, the course was designed, or the unit was designed, before the issue of, oh, by the way, we need an online exam came up. There was a sort of a complex arrangement with the way this particular unit was run as to why we didn't get the request to say, how are we going to run an exam in a purely online course until most of the course materials and course design was already finished. So, oops. Clunky drawing tool, I said that before. And I think the complexity added by the remote proctoring situation really added to it beyond what was reasonable. I mean, there was the contextual factors that this was a first run pilot. So this is not us having refined our workflows and refined the technology. This was a first run pilot, so it reflects that. All those difficult confounding factors I talked about before, inability to scaffold the inking practice into the course. I mean, it's technology introduction, it's unit design, it's pedagogy 101. Scaffold in what you want the students to do for the high stakes assessments. Now, having said that, on day one of the course, we had a zero stakes practice quiz that the students could do with the digital inking tools. However, we couldn't force them to do it. It was only purely optional, but it was available. So I mean, that's me saying we did our best under the circumstances. Then, of course, there was the problematic data collection, which is really impacting, I think, there was some decrees from further above that said that we couldn't force everybody to do this thing just after they finished the exam. Now, in all of my other exams research for the last 7 years, I've tried to have students fill in the survey as soon as they'd finished the exam. In the circumstances where I've been able to achieve that, my response rates have been above 90%. So in this circumstance, you can see where this was given to the students by somebody else 3 or 4 weeks after the exams had finished. Low response rates, you know. What will we do next time? What will we do to improve the situation? Definitely we want to refine and fix the drawing tool. So, you know, if I had the funds and the access, I would change the way the drawing tool works to improve its usability and to improve the way it handled data. In particular, the autosave functionality was not quite up to scratch as far as I'm concerned. The students gave some feedback in here as well, particularly around the text input tool and the fact that it also didn't allow copy and paste. So you couldn't copy and paste between individual question areas. So each question had a different Moodle tool input area, and the fact that you couldn't copy any content out of one and put it in the other, I think they found frustrating. There was also a move tool, which allow you to move the canvas around. Now, ordinarily that wouldn't be a problem, but the problem with the autosave in this particular tool is it takes a snapshot of only the visible canvas, which is kind of stupid if you think about it. Why not just save the full extent of the drawing canvas? But no, it only shaved the snapshot of what you could see with your own eyes, even though you could move content off the edge. So removing the move tool would prevent that problem. The other way would be to, I suppose, reprogram the tool so it actually saved everything, God forbid. But because we'd taken this tool from somewhere else, who had taken it from somewhere else, that would require a bit more funding than I had access to at the time and a bit more time than I had access to at the time to achieve. Refine the user documentation. We had written quite extensive written documentation with screenshots, but the students suggested, oh, can you give us some videos of how to use the tool? And I think that comes down to, you know, the way people learn these days. There's not much you can't learn off YouTube. Students are getting used to the idea, oh, we need to have videos and what have you. You know, if you look at Khan Academy, and that shows you that, you know, online videos for learning things is really a successful modality. So, you know, gain more time and funding videos of how to use the tools. Practice and instructions should be built into the course design itself. Again, this is just good pedagogical design. There really should be the weekly practice quizzes, for example. We should be asking the students to use their graphics tablets, putting the right kinds of questions in there. So we are scaffolding and building up to the final assessment using their formative assessments. So the same toolkit should be used for formative activity as you do for summative activity. Again, it's pedagogy 101. And of course, if I had my time again, I would probably run the digital inking pilot on-campus lab machines first to iron out a lot of the usability issues before we went into the high sort of stakes, high complex remote proctoring situation. But you know what they say about hindsight, it's 2020. So yes, what works and what didn't. Digital inking, yes, it did work, but it needs to be with practice, practice, practice. Because, you know, STEM students are probably not going to encounter graphics tablets normally. That's a new input device. Personally, it took me about 3 separate goes over 3 separate days, if you will, to be able to at least start to use that graphics tablet with some degree of proficiency that didn't look like chickens walking across the screen. So from that point of view, practice, practice, practice. Remote proctoring vendors, don't ask, don't tell is their philosophy. You know, if you don't know what you don't know, you can't ask the question. And this is why you need to do pilots. This is why you need to do, you know, practice runs yourself. Again, we're not telling you anything you don't already know, folks. Delivery, what sort of works? We also had other pilots of using Safe Exam Browser with Moodle quizzes in computer labs. That worked fantastically. Well, ETH Zurich do that all the time for their final exam, so it's not surprising. It's a well-practiced path. And I reckon if we go SEB, Moodle, and graphics tablets in a computer lab environment, that this could be quite a successful way of going about doing STEM exams. BYOD plus SE on its own, security failure. Again, ETH Zurich don't recommend yet path. I've done some other work around computerized exams using a live Linux bootable USBs, and we solved that problem of the security side whilst allowing a full computer environment. But that's, again, that's probably a completely different talk. That's a different lecture. All right, so I'm just about done. If you've got any questions, let me just minimize there so I can get back to, if I can find a text chat just to see if anybody's putting any chat into. Right.
Matthew, we've got some questions on the Moodle site. We've got a question.
Okay. Yep.
So thank you for that talk. That was really interesting. I think it was good to see a really novel, well, maybe not completely novel, but not widely used input method. All of the concerns you had to do with exactly how students input things. So we have one question from Paul Howes, who says, do you make the students buy their own laptops and tablets?
Yes. So the assumption was that the students would come to the degree program with a BYOD, bring their own laptop. We did provide, so even before the students had confirmed their enrollment in the master's program, we did provide recommendations of the sort of equipment, particularly a sort of a laptop we would recommend to buy. Now, a lot of these students were already working, so I guess there was some advantage in that the minimum standard in terms of financial capability to get into the program is going to be a bit higher than your average undergraduate who is going to be perhaps using their uncle's computer or the one that their parents bought from high school. You know, hopefully most of the laptops were okay. Now, if the students was near the campus, we did offer the chance for them to borrow a laptop and a tablet. The purchase, so I guess really the odd part out was the graphics tablet purchase. And we did look at low cost alternatives, low cost options. So that's why we look for the $50 to $60 range tablets. We weren't going to ask students to spend hundreds of dollars. So we thought that, you know, $50 or $60 might be within the realm of possibility. And if the student was really hard up and contacted us, we honestly probably would have just bought them one and sent it to them, you know. For the cost of $50, it's you know, for a low SES student, $50 is a lot. Okay, let's just give them the tablet. That way they can participate fully in the program. I mean, I think that's a low, I mean, and BYOD policies in institutions and accessibility and equity is a broader issue anyway, that we have to tackle. And maybe things like e-assessment is going to, you know, sort of bring that to the fore a bit more. And I certainly recommended, as you know, before I left that university, as to then you need to have a comprehensive BYOD policy in order to make this stuff work. Yes, it might be for a final exam, but actually to fully participate in a degree program these days, you're hard pressed if you haven't got a laptop. I couldn't imagine doing a degree through my mobile phone. I just would go crazy with frustration personally. But you know, students try it because they don't have the financial means. So I think universities need to sort of rethink what is the minimum set of kit and how we get that in the students' hands.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with all of that. And I think, in fact, at Newcastle, we have just made the decision, I think, can I say that, Chris? That we're going to give all of our undergraduates tablets when they start their degree, just so that everybody's got the kit that we need them to have. Yeah, thanks for that. So we have a question in the Zoom chat this time. Ian Tarrant. He says, in using similar input devices with staff and students, I found a minority of people had great difficulty using the input devices. They couldn't get the hang of writing in one place and looking on screen. Was this not a problem for any of you?
Yeah, look, I agree. Because my personal experience was a 50-50 situation. So the last time I tried using a graphics tablet was probably 10 years ago. So I had a really jaded view of these things too. Because, you know, 10 years ago, the quality of a graphics tablet and the responsiveness was actually terrible. But these days, when I got a hand, even that Huon tablet, not to promote a particular brand, but that one was That Huon tablet was the most comfortable I found to use. It was also one of the cheapest ones and one of the largest surface area ones. Now, as I said, I took 3 goes. The first time I looked at that hand-eye coordination thing, where you're writing over on the side and it's moving around on the screen, yeah, it takes a while for your hand and brain to connect again. But after I reckon I'd done it for a couple of times over 3 days, I was used to it. And hence, practice makes perfect. Hence, never, ever, ever, ever get a student to do new technologies or new techniques in a high stakes exam for the first time. You're asking for trouble, right? We all know that. And as Tim said, there's no way you should do this but we were really in a rock and a hard place. There was no other solution, at least that we had put ourselves into. Or we were given the job to solve this problem. Now, in the future, maybe what they should be doing is thinking about, how do you ask your questions so that they don't have to be kept completely confidential? How do you, work it so that the students can have a surface to scribble on? Now, in later part, the second trial, what they did is they said, right, you can have a portable whiteboard and you can allow the students to draw on a whiteboard. So at least the pen and the eye coordination. So if they wanted to do their sketches, their rough notes, and their workings out on the whiteboard, they could then flip it up and show it to the webcam, and then show them rubbing it off when they're done. But we were given the job, so this is the solution we came up with. I did see another one there from Jamaro. How many students took an exam in this way? There were, I think, about 150 over the 2 cohorts. Don't quote me on it because I've actually lost the information about the student totals. But there was about 50, 60 so students, up to 70 students in the first cohort, and I think slightly less in the second cohort, but it was around that. Now, every student who took that master's program was able to do that online exam and hand it in. Admittedly, it wasn't a nice experience for everybody, but the fact that it worked at a base, what you might call a minimum viable product, I think the idea is viable. It needs further refinement. That's kind of what I took away from it.
We have one more question from the Moodle site. Ione Lutz, I don't know if it's Lutz, I've forgotten. She says, in South Africa, we've gone the route of subsidizing laptops for the really poor students on the basis that the laptop is on loan to them and then they need to give it back at the end of the year. If the laptop's still in good shape, they don't pay. If the laptop's broken, the cost is added to their account. That's in fact not a question.
Yeah. Tim Hunt's pointing something out about, are you going to answer the marking question from the Moodle site? I'm not sure what the marking question was, but
I'm struggling to
have
find
it go.
actually. I thought that was going to be that. Is it on a different section? I can't see it.
Paul Hughes has got a comment about the XY. Yes, so this idea of the tablet equaling the screen, I suppose is something we have to work out over time, and that's why we tried to play with some tablets and give students some recommendations, and which is why I was sort of saying, yes, okay, it might vary in the X and Y, but actually it's not too bad in terms of how close it is, because you're not drawing on the screen directly. You're moving it's a bit hard to explain, moving on the graphics tablet on the side, and the thing is moving on the screen. The trick is to make sure that your hand and what you see on the screen match up. So you would make adjustments if there is particularly more movement in the X axis versus the Y axis. So I think you would naturally adjust to that anyway. And as I said, the graphics artists use these things. Go and have a look on the internet for, graphics tablets and art, and you'll see some really fantastically fine detailed artworks out there. So, technical drawings and graphical drawings and artistic free flow drawing, painting, portraiture, all sorts of things is there. So to me, it tells me that the idea of a graphics tablet as an input device is a workable solution, but that it's not something that you can pick up and run with on day one. That's the caveat to it.
Okay, thank you. So I found the marking question. Everybody else has also pointed me to it. The question is from James Friday. Did instructors overall find it more difficult to mark work in this format?
Actually, I can't answer the question because we never got to ask them, embarrassingly. Let's just look at it from the logical point of view. In terms of workflow, it's a Moodle quiz. So if you're used to marking things in a Moodle quiz, yes. You do have the messy handwriting dimension, which could make it problematic. The examination itself was a mixture of drawing input, text input, and numeric input questions. So with the overall combination, it's a Moodle quiz and it takes on those characteristics. So there could be a certain amount of typed input which are easier. Some people did use the typed input in the text tool, and therefore you would get readable output on that. For those people who did scribble on there, then you're probably going to get the same degree of messing handwriting interpretation that you normally do. So 6 of one, half a dozen of the other is the long answer. Yeah.
We've got time for, I think, one last question, and then we'll move it strictly onto the Moodle site after this session. Chris Sanguine says, in Edinburgh, they're experimenting with tablets. Did you do an experiment of tablet capture against, first of all, typing into an essay question type, and second, just taking a photo of working with a phone and uploading it?
Comparing to an essay, no, because the responses in this exam didn't require long essay responses. Probably 1 or 2 sentences were the most, and we gave them a text box for those type of responses. We gave them the drawing response option. So some actually we gave them both. We gave them a text box, and underneath we gave them another, it's basically a blank question, if you like, with the Moodle input tool to say, hey, show your working out, do your drawings here if you want to. So students had a choice of which one they wanted to use. So I can imagine that if you're doing maths intensive, you could have, the question could still use stack or whatever mathematical input tool, and underneath you could use the Moodle as an option for students to show their working out. The take a photograph of the paper thing, that was considered. The complication starts to arise when how you get to upload. And I noticed Andrew down there has made a comment around, getting the students to write it out on a piece of paper, photograph it, and then upload it. People have done that. So actually where I'm working now at Macquarie, I believe some of the academics in our exam period, which is just finishing at the end of this week, did use that technique for their online exams. They just got the students to write it, photograph it, upload it. And you can get mobile phone apps now that turn your little photographs into PDFs that you can email up and things. So I think that's a viable option in some circumstances. In this exam, the academics didn't want it to happen because it means that the questions could escape. So part of the assessment integrity framework around this particular exam is we didn't want the students to write on paper because that paper would go with them. How do you then stop them taking the paper with them? We can't have a metal trash bin and then burning the paper in front of the camera. But the idea of using a whiteboard, I think, might be a reasonable, a small portable whiteboard. You can buy them in, most office supply stores, and a few dollars each. Then the problem becomes okay, how do you photograph it to make sure that the thing is in focus? If you're showing it to a webcam or you're using a phone, it's got to be in focus. And so there's quite a few steps in that process as well that could potentially go wrong. But I did notice that the comment in I think it was somebody mentioned there that they did try it and was reasonably successful. So I think that is also an option, provided you don't mind your questions can escape after the exam. But bear in mind, students have brains and memories. So for students to be able to crowdsource all the questions in your exam is not particularly difficult anyway. In my mind, as soon as a group of students have laid eyes on your questions, consider them public knowledge. We know that students that live in residential colleges, for example, right? That's the American sororities or, problem. I know in universities where I've worked before, where they've had on-campus residential colleges, the students would get together after the exam and crowdsource all the questions together, and they would then go into the filing cabinet for the next round of students. So, and these days, of course, we've got online, you know, note sharing websites and Facebook groups and all sorts of things where they can crowdsource on a large scale. So, you know, anybody who thinks they can keep their question database safe is, I think, sadly mistaken, which is why I think things like Stack, when you can have almost infinitesimal numbers of variables and formats for questions, are going to help us in that regard as well. But at the same time, if you can Google the answer to a question, or you can, you know, if you're making formulaic questions, then students will learn strategically the questions. So it's part of the game.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that, Matthew. I think
You're welcome.
Your talk and the questions have raised a few questions about the integrity of online exams. We've got a few talks later in the week about that. I think there's still a couple more questions on the Moodle site, which we don't have time to take right now. So if you could have a go at answering those later on.
I'll jump on afterwards and see if I can answer the questions. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.